So we're here today because, as we all know, the December school shooting in Newtown, Connecticut really left the nation stunned and scared that something that tragic could happen again. And communities across the country are struggling to understand why it happened. And that has touched off a national dialogue on how to prevent such tragedies from happening and what the best practices should be in terms of keeping students safe when they're in public schools. Here in Texas, just at the legislative level, we've seen a slew of proposals that range from more broad-based approaches that talk about having various firearms trainings for public school employees, funding for mental health programs, to more simple proposals that are just, maybe we should have the same kind of security alarms in schools as they have in banks, that a teacher can access press and law enforcement will be alerted. And then at the local level, we've seen a lot of districts who have tried to navigate this issue on their own. That includes an increasing number, a handful of them, who have gone ahead with their own firearms policies and allowed school employees to complete training to carry their weapons on campus. But amidst all of this conversation, there has been some debate about what the best way is to spend the increasingly spare public dollars when we're going after trying to make schools safer. So I think maybe just to open up, Dr. Calder, I mean, the prospect of having a repeat of what happened in Connecticut is terrifying for everyone, and these conversations about school safety are important. But these incidents are very rare. Is there something that needs to be changed in the way that Texas schools, public schools, are approaching security right now?
Well, I think the good news is that Texas is very strong as a state compared to much of the country in terms of how our schools have addressed the comprehensive model for school safety. So we have established, beginning in 2007, standards. They're called the Texas Unified School Safety and Security Standards, and they address all 4 phases of emergency management: how to prevent disasters of all kinds, how to mitigate those things that we can't prevent in order to reduce the loss of lives and property, how to prepare for those things, how to respond to them, and how to recover from them. So our standards are scalable, where even the smallest district with very few resources could address the standards in a certain fashion, as well as the largest, most well-funded and well-organized district. So we're happy about that. I think that some of the areas where we may need to strengthen our procedures would be pertaining to drills particularly. We find again and again that the more people have drilled so that everyone knows exactly what to do for multi-hazards, the more lives are saved. So that's one area that we could be a bit stronger. And we are looking at the audits and looking to perhaps strengthen the fidelity of the audits. The school audits cover not just facility audits for hazards in the facility, but our schools developing their multi-hazard emergency operations plans and keeping those current. Are they conducting drills? Are they collaborating with community partners so that fire, police, EMS understand what the schools will be doing, and vice versa, for that coordinated effort? So I think we're very strong.
Well, Ms. Baskin, you have been working with school districts as everyone has been looking to revise their local policies, or at least review the local policies they have in place. What are you finding that they're encountering as they go through that process?
Well, they are reflecting on that comprehensive approach, and as you know, with over 1,000 school districts and such a variety of geographic circumstances in our state, districts are really in very different circumstances, and there are very small rural districts that have much less access to coordinated efforts with other law enforcement or emergency services. And then there are other urban or suburban settings where there's a great deal of collaboration. I just talked to folks, for instance, from Judson ISD today, who have 20 jurisdictions overlapping in their district of different emergency services responders. So wildly different circumstances. So certainly local control is a very strong message that I'm hearing from around the state. Folks want to look at their own town and look at what's needed in their own town. I think there's a lot of interest also in facilities and making sure that facilities are strong and plans are strong. But there is also, I will say, interest in increasing access to emergency services, including access to properly trained folks who have firearms.
And Representative Villalba, this is something that you've decided to take up at the legislative level. What was kind of behind your proposal, and what inspired you to file that legislation?
Well, like all Americans on that day, when we saw what happened up in Newtown, I was just deeply impacted. I dropped my little girl off at kindergarten that morning, and by that afternoon I'd heard that 26-year-olds, her age, had been murdered. And so immediately I'm thinking to myself, how can this happen? How can this happen in America? What can we do in America to fix this? Well, I'm a Texas House member, so I can do something. So we got to the computer that night and I said, well, what would work? I mean, look, I appreciate greatly the existing security protocols that we have in place, and Texas does an excellent job of really understanding that we've got to have multiple lines of defense against these kinds of perpetrators. But in the end, we have to have one last line of defense, and I think that's where parents like me want that choice, and that is to have greater law enforcement in the classroom. Our law enforcement does an excellent job of getting to the scene of an instance very quickly, 12, 15 minutes depending upon where you are. In more rural areas it can be longer, but in a county like Dallas, in a DISD, where you even have SRO programs, it still takes 12 to 15 minutes. In Newtown, all the damage was done in the first 7 minutes. So my thinking was, well, how can we craft a response that would reduce that time from 7 minutes down to seconds? And the only way I could come up with was something like the federal air marshal program that you have in the skies. So you have an individual who's serving in a covert capacity. No one knows who this person is. But in that moment of crisis, when somebody's banging on the door of the cockpit, this person can spring into action in that very narrow circumstance and immediately disarm the perpetrator. Same thing with my legislation. We have an individual who's been trained as a law enforcement officer. This is not a CHL standard type of training. It's not 8 hours at a local, gun range with a paper target. We're talking 80 hours of comprehensive and robust training from law enforcement personnel that are actually training police academy officers. They're going through active shooter training, emergency situations training, legal training, and they're going through a psychological evaluation. Obviously, we don't want somebody who's not capable mentally of acting in that moment of crisis from being able to do so. So what we did is said, let's train these people who are currently employed by the school. Could be a vice principal, could be a custodian, could be even a teacher. Give them the requisite training, they're volunteers, and have them go through this process. And then they would only have authority to act. They're not walking around breaking up fights. They're not at a gas station arresting someone. They only have authority to act when the front door has been kicked open and human life is being taken or threatened. So that's what the legislation does. We think that it's narrow, it's practical, it's very restricted, it has a number of safeguards. I'm not interested in teacher carry. I know that some have talked about my bill as being guns in schools, or this is a teacher carry bill. We're not interested in that. And this is not a Herald ISD style arrangement. This is expanding law enforcement into the classroom, who has a very narrow authority to act only if children's lives are being taken.
And Herald ISD, just for members in the audience that might not know, is a school district near the Oklahoma border. There's about 100 students enrolled there, and since 2007, I think this was inspired by the shootings at Virginia Tech, teachers or any school employee has the option to go through a training program, and then if they are CHL holders and bring their their firearms to school. And it's something that I've talked with the superintendent out there, and he says that he's gotten a lot of phone calls from superintendents around the state who are interested, particularly in rural districts. But I think there is probably a sense out there that maybe we want to let our teachers teach and not have, and if we can afford it, get the armed guards. I think if we can afford it is kind of the piece of the puzzle there, and for districts that do opt for having employees armed, the main appeal, I would assume, is budgetary. But I mean, are there other ways to work within existing funding levels to improve school security on campus?
I think that, again, the addressing prevention in terms of threat assessment and understanding how to address individuals who pose a threat, not just make a threat, but who exhibit behaviors of concern is one key. And that's available with existing staff in most, with training in most areas. I do think CPTED, crime prevention through environmental design, so that especially new facilities that are being built have that caveat that they're built with attention to school safety and security. Again, drills are the key. Again and again, drills save lives. With the response phase, we do find, and there is research that shows that police presence in any setting, whether it be a school or an athletic event, is a deterrent. So that it's not just about the response to have a law enforcement presence. That's also a powerful piece of prevention. As well as the recovery phase, continuity of operations, continuity of government for schools is different from business and industry, especially when there's a crime scene. Where will classes resume tomorrow? The psychological recovery, of course, is extremely powerful with school tragedies. So we think that all 4 areas could be strengthened, and there are many, many ways to do that with existing resources.
I'll jump in. I don't think we can understate, though, how interested schools would be in having more funding available for strengthening facilities and for strengthening access to properly trained security personnel. Existing facilities are extremely difficult and expensive to retrofit. We had about 100 districts come to the TASB offices recently to talk with our risk management folks about various issues related to safety, and one of the things that they mentioned several times was the expense of bulletproof glass and the expense related to the ideas, for instance, of the panic buttons, which they found appealing, but couldn't figure out where they'd find the dollars.
Well, yeah, let's talk about that, the facilities aspect, because I think that's something that sometimes doesn't get brought up enough in these kinds of conversations. What are, most public schools, what are their facilities now, and what could be changed about them to make them more secure?
Points of access.
Yes.
Tonight, I know that's something you know a great deal about.
Yes, access control is a key, but only to a certain point. I think within the facility, we know that certain key features of environmental design enhance safety and security. Most teachers, most students know where the hot spots are, where students are likely to gather and bully or have fights, and simply manning those areas with staff during passing period and open times like cafeteria time can be a powerful deterrent. So sometimes it's a practical assessment, and that's what the audits are designed for, is to look at where, when, and how disruption of various kinds or violence might be most likely to occur.
And Ms. Beto, what are you hearing from parents in the state and from the members of your organization about what their concerns about school security are?
Sure. Well, there's several, and parents are glad that we have been asked to have a seat at the table for this conversation, because I think even the legislature and everybody recognizes that if you're going to be talking about school safety, it's not going to be credible without input from the parents. And so the legislation that looked at the specific CHL and firearms training came down, and that's when parents went, whoa, what happened on December 14th was horrible, but there's nothing that happened there that said this is all of a sudden good policy. to give all of our teachers and administrators guns with just firearms training. So that brought parents out and said, we need other options, which is why we have seen legislation that is local control to address communities' needs, as well as where's the funding mechanism for this. You know, parents with the drills, we've had parents come to us and say that when you've got lockdown drills and fire drills and tornado drills, and there were different drills depending on the threat that happened in the school. And parents aren't aware that all of those go on. And then what's the reunite phase? We talk about recovery a lot. If my kid gets evacuated to the football field, what do I do? How do I pick them up? That aspect of it, I think that we need to be doing a better job of educating parents on, and making sure they're part of the conversation. And again, we've got parents, we've got 4, 5, and 6-year-olds who don't even know that Sandy Hook happened for good reason. And so if all of a sudden there's a one-size-fits-all legislation that's passed that says we're going to have armed guards and we're going to have this in our schools, suddenly you've got to explain to a kindergartner, why is there an armed guard at my school? Your school's not safe. The people in this room can't get their arms around and explain what happened at Sandy Hook. And to explain that to a 5-year-old that you're not safe at school, they believe in, for the most part, they are. And so making sure that it's sensible, looking for a funding mechanism, because our teachers with testing and the reduction in funds already, to make sure that the same education dollar that we're supposed to be teaching our kids with is not used for the school safety enhancements that are needed. But we're watching to make sure that there's a funding mechanism there, even if it's a local option, and that parents are at the table for that.
And Representative Villalba, what are your thoughts on the funding piece of all of this?
And that's the critical question, and one that we're wrestling with in the legislature. And as you know, with education, we have a debate ongoing now with respect to just merely educational funding. And that has nothing to do with security enhancement. It has everything to do with the kind of resources we're placing into the schools. I mean, as you know, we cut deeply into education resources in the last legislative session. I think there's momentum building to restore some, if not all, of those cuts, so long as they're coupled with comprehensive reform. But I don't think there's an allocation set aside for resources for instance, hiring security guards. Look, if I could say today, or if I could write a bill that I thought would get passed, where we have a security guard posted at every school in all of Texas, by all means, that's the answer, right? We're all for that. But you know that that is something, and everyone knows that we just could not afford that in the state with the current resources that we have. So what's the next best option? The next best option, we believe, is to provide the kind of resource that we provide, which is essentially the same thing as a security guard at a much lower cost expenditure. We've been speaking with a number of school districts, one very large one in Dallas, and they tell us that my bill will save them millions of dollars, because instead of going out and hiring 75 security guards, they're going to instead pay for the training for these individuals and also provide additional compensation for the individual serving in this role. Just like you would a bus driver, you'd pay them $4,000 or $5,000 more, or a coach. Same thing here, you would provide a teacher or a vice principal with an additional compensation component to make up for that. And that's a way to move from a $65,000 a year security guard down to a $10,000 school marshal. And we think that's a way that we can efficiently utilize existing resources and dollars to enhance security measures in the school.
And that's something that, in your legislation, that's something that would be paid for at the local level?
Right. Our legislation is purely optional at the local control. As Joy points out, there's no one size fits all. You know, Harold ISD is going to be completely different than Houston ISD. And so they will all have different ways that they attack this challenge. But what we're trying to do is provide the proper elements to provide them with different options, and that's how we're going to do it.
There's a concern that when these options, it's kind of a balance between local control and also, you know, making sure that every district, if they feel that they need that security, has the ability to pay for it. I mean, there's an ongoing school finance lawsuit going right now that deals a lot with the issues of equity. What are ways that the state, or even I guess at the local level, that communities can kind of deal with the possibility that one district is not going to have as much revenue from property taxes to pay for security as another district?
Representative Huberty in the House, and then a couple of senators, have drafted a bill that provides for tax allocation districts for school security. So what that would mean is that at a local level, local control, local option, a municipality or a county or an ISD could add an additional 0.5% tax on the property, and then that would be earmarked for security measures. So that's one way that we're talking about doing it, where you have an earmark at a local level, decided at a local level for that. There's resistance to that because anytime we start talking about increasing taxes, that makes people nervous, and it makes people nervous not only in the local municipality but statewide. So we'll see how that plays out, but that's one of the proposals that's out there. You know, the only other way to do it, I think, is to reallocate existing resources that we have provided for education into security measures. And I don't think many people are comfortable with that because we know that we do have significant burdens to educate our kids with the resources that we have, and we can't be spending X amount of dollars on, you know, panic buttons when we really need desks and HVAC systems in the school. So that's a challenge that we work with. There's no question that there's no free lunch, and we live in a world of limited resources where we can't have everything that we want. So our objective in the House and the Senate is to find a way to efficiently solve problems that we know aren't going to be perfect solutions, but at least give our children the protection they need and a fighting chance in the instance of that most horrifying situation that we hope never happens in Texas.
And Ms. Baskin, I mean, are there ways to get at the equity piece? I mean, that's a way that it's possible to pay for it, but I mean, how can we get at that equity piece that a poor school district won't be able to afford the same kind of resources for security as a wealthier one?
I'm not a school finance expert, but I'll say two things on that. One is that as our membership talked about this option the other day, about the tax option, they appreciated the local control aspect of it and that it was optional. They appreciated the idea that there could be access to additional funds for this special purpose. They were concerned about the equity piece, and many of them came forward with specific numbers that this kind of numbers you've heard before in the school finance litigation, right? To achieve the same amount of revenue, this district taxes at a penny, and this district would have to tax at a quarter to obtain the same revenue. So that's certainly a concern for them. There are legislative mechanisms for rewarding effort and leveling that out. It goes by a variety of names.
Yes.
Robin Hood and others.
Right. Also not currently very popular. I guess it kind of depends on who you talk to on that. Well, so we've talked a little bit about the response part of this. What about the other pieces of the school security puzzle, like mitigation and prevention and just being prepared instead of being in a reactive position? If anyone wants to address that, yeah.
I think that's the key. The preparation is mainly in the drills and everyone knowing what to do, including visitors to the building, including substitute teachers. So we have a lot of resources for what we call just-in-time training, so that there's no reason why anyone in the building wouldn't know how to do a lockdown and how to evacuate and how to parent-student reunify, which is very much part of the plan, and we have a good model for that. But I think that the prevention includes so many things. Bully prevention, we know, is a key, and establishing a positive school climate. I was in Washington, D.C. this past Wednesday at the White House for the hearings with Secretary of Education Arne Duncan and Secretary Janet Napolitano regarding school safety. And again we found from the victims from Virginia Tech who were there, the teacher from Sandy Hook who was there, and all of the participants in the panels, that prevention is a key, as well as mitigation. So I do think that positive school climate is a key to getting the intelligence that you need. It's very rare to have a school instance of violence, especially a school shooting, without what we call leakage. Someone knows. And how do we create an environment where those perhaps disenfranchised youth who suspect something's going to happen feel safe in coming to an adult and know how to do that, and can trust the adults to receive that information and do the right thing. So I think that when you look at the comprehensive approach, even looking at the most, I suppose it's still the most violent instance of school slaughter in our history of our country. It was in Bath, Michigan in 1927, and 43 students and teachers were blown up with explosives set off by the school board treasurer. So it really highlights preparedness and mitigation. That person had complete access to the school, as do many of the school shooters. So access control is so important and so critical, and yet who's to say that the act of violence won't be committed by someone who has absolutely every right to be there. So that's where the preparedness comes into play, as well as prevention and recovery.
Oh, go ahead.
I would just say a word about what's often called threat assessment, or just picking up on cues that you might hear, for instance, from students, or even, as we say, parents or staff who are in the school. I feel very strongly that our school employees and students need to be in an environment where they feel willing to bring information forward. I think there's a lot of fear among school district staff, particularly, that if they speak out to a parent or they speak out to others, in the mental health environment, they feel like it's not going to be well received. So there's a lot of fear in bringing forward that information, that they will be accused of overstepping their bounds. And the other aspect of that is that even though school employees do have a wealth of information about students' well-being, there's no way always to be able to identify a violent actor before the act of violence. And so I think a lot could be done to open up the avenues of communication between staff and parents, but also that has to happen with an understanding that when the act of violence is not identified in advance, with that 20/20 hindsight, there's not been blame or litigation that comes on to the school district for not being able to identify the problem.
Ms. Beto, speak to the parent side of these things. Is there an understanding among the parents that you talk to that having these kinds of conversations with administrators, with teachers, is an important piece of the school security?
Absolutely, and it needs to be happening more often. Our counselors they have to do scheduling and testing for 16 EOCs, per student. And so there's not a lot of what I'll call the softer skills kind of counseling available. And so you've got a parent who has a kid who's been in a dark place for a few days. Well, is it because Johnny and Susie broke up and he's just down, or is there something more here? And there's not a clear line of what to do, and there's not a good line of communication between parent, staff or teacher, and counselor. And if you want to talk about funding, I don't know how you fund more counselors, but the return on that investment is much greater than it is on something having to do with a piece of equipment. And so one of the things that the parents are talking about is, how can you do that? We've heard from all these tragedies that the parents tried to get help and they couldn't for one reason or another. They were denied help, or a crime hadn't occurred yet. And then there's also the flip side of it, where if you report something and it's not major enough, do you get somebody in a system and they don't need to be there? And so I think that, and parents are in huge favor of a positive school climate where you can report better, where there's more communication. And when our kids and our families are healthier by default, our movie theaters, our malls, our bowling alleys will be safer as well. And so when you look at investment in the dollar, I think that as you look towards the kids and identifying and preventing and intervening when it's smart and necessary before it happens, and that's where parents are asking for the help, is we need educated on when to make the phone call, who to make the phone call to, and is somebody available there. So that's definitely a big piece of the puzzle that needs looked at.
Yeah, and Dr. Calder, is that something that you deal with at the school safety center? Is there research out there about best practices for how to strengthen that communication between parents, schools, students?
Yes, very much so. In our emergency operations planning and training and drilling, again and again we say co-plan, co-train, and co-drill with collaborative partners, including not only first responders, but the parents as well and other community members. So everyone knowing what to do in an emergency includes parents knowing ahead of time not only how to prevent and how to report, but where to go for that reunification. And when you get there, to understand having the right identification to collect that child, and that there is a plan and that there will be a wait. And so those kinds of things are very, very powerful in making for a smooth response system. But to your point, and earlier as well, Joy, when you said that there are so many different resources available, even when we're able to identify individuals with behaviors of concern, someone who could potentially become violent. In the rural areas particularly, there are so few mental health resources that it's very challenging to know what to do next. But we do advise anonymous tip lines at every school to report anything from bullying to potential threats, and the anonymity of those tip lines is a key for both parents and students as well.
Any comprehensive plan would include the focus on the mental health aspect of this, because there's no question, if you look at the statistics, the individuals who are perpetrating these types of crimes are people who have either had a history, who have exhibited some level of mental issue, or they have, again, through leakage, might have exhibited that they're capable of this kind of behavior. And we need to focus more resources on that, and we need to have better facilities where we can screen these individuals. But in the end, no matter what we do in that regard, no matter how much training, no matter how much precautionary action we take, if an individual in our free society wants to cause harm, they will do it one way. They will seek out the weakest and softest target, movie theaters, libraries, churches, schools, and they will access that because they can with a firearm, and they will destroy human life. So I agree with everything everyone's saying here, and we need to do everything we can with respect to resources and funding and financing and screening and all that. But in the end, bad things will happen in our free society because people can do it, and because we have people who are mentally capable of taking these kinds of actions. So the proposals that we're putting forward are reactionary only because we recognize that there are going to be these situations. We have to do something. And this is a way to safeguard it, short of having a trained police officer in the front and or at every exit of every school in the state. What are we to do? And we can do all these other things we're talking about. But if you look at Sandy Hook, if you look at that school, they had a training program, they had a mental health screening, they had all the different things. They had a wonderful open community, beautiful families in that community, and yet it still happened in an idyllic community like that. If it can happen in Sandy Hook, it can happen in Groesbeck, Texas, it can happen in Round Rock, Texas, it can happen in Dallas, Texas. So we've got to be prepared for that moment of crisis, and we've got to take necessary and drastic action to respond to that and be ready for that.
Well, you mentioned that schools like churches and other places are soft targets. They're, we think of a school, we think of it as a place of education. It is supposed to be open and inviting to community members. Do we need to rethink that approach to schools when we're looking at security, or is there a balance to be found there between a school and something that looks like a prison?
Well, there's no need to institute martial law in our society, and no, by no means should we. I don't want an armed guard in my school. That's why, again, what we're proposing would have a covert individual. So it's a very subtle, post of a sign on the front door saying this school is protected by a certified and licensed law enforcement officer. Enter at your own risk. When the shooter in Colorado, Aurora, Colorado, earlier this year in the Batman opening, decided which target. He went to 7 other theaters before he chose the gun-free zone at the theater that he ultimately chose. They choose soft targets because they know they can cause as much damage as possible there. So in a school situation where we know these are gun-free zones, as long as people understood that these are protected zones, they may or may not be gun-free. I think that's the answer. Again, I'm not advocating for teacher carry. I'm not advocating for guns in schools. I'm not advocating for martial law or posted police officers at every exit. But what I am advocating for is to provide our children with the fighting chance when that situation does occur, because it will occur eventually, because we have people in our society who are bent on causing destruction of human life.
I have a question for you. It was very interesting at the symposium that we had recently at TASB. Dr. Blair was one of the speakers. Dr. Blair works closely with Dr. Calder, and he talked about an initiative that they are working on called Don't Name Them.
Yes.
And it's the idea of having organizations and eventually the media thinking about, at least considering the idea of not naming the perpetrators, because so often what is stated as a reason that's given, most of the events that have happened have involved folks who were suicidal and who were choosing to create violence before they ended their own lives, and in part it was to create fame for themselves, and the idea of controlling their name and that fame either through the media or other means.
Yeah.
Do you have a thought?
I do, actually. I mean, that's something that I think that came up in a lot of the conversation about the ex-LAPD officer who went missing and terrorized the whole city for, I think, almost a week. Was that part of his stated reason in the manifesto was he had a vendetta to carry out, but it was motivated by what you describe. And I think that there is a need for a sensitivity to that in the media, but I also think that the goal of news organizations is to put information out there, and that piece of the fact is the information. But of course, when we saw in the initial reporting after Newtown, there was just on social media, there was just a slew of information out there that half of it turned out to be inaccurate, and rumors were flying, and it was. I think it kind of contributed to this atmosphere of chaos, and kind of nobody really knew what was going on. But I think that, again, there is that, sometimes it's a tension, and sometimes you can find a good balance between, putting the information out there to the public about what has happened and refraining from, contributing to legend making of these people who want to commit these kinds of crimes. But is that, so it seems like there are so many different things that are issues that are in society that are kind of coming into schools. Schools are becoming the front lines for battles over mental health in society. We talked the media aspect. How is it that, and I'm trying to think if there is really another institution that is encountering it, but it really seems like schools have become kind of this ground zero for these issues. And I think that it can put a lot of tension on teachers and administrators to try and, okay, now maybe they're potentially going to be training how to use firearms. Now they're going to need to be able to recognize and identify the symptoms of mental illnesses. How do we go about making sure that schools are actually going to be able to do the things that they're there to do, which is teach kids in the classroom?
So you've mentioned those things, and kids by law have to go to school. You don't have to go to a movie theater, you don't have to go to the mall, but you do by law have to go to school, and you're there 8 hours a day. I don't think that job is on teachers alone. As parents, we need help. We need to be doing a better job in spending time with our kids and taking a look at this issue. And maybe one of the good things that came from Sandy Hook is that I think that day families did step back and say, you know, we huddled up for the day and said, you know, we're not going to fight today, and we're going to keep our family together, and you kind of look at it through your own eyes and the four walls that you live within. And so teachers, we want teachers focused on teaching, but they have our kids 8 hours a day for most of the year. But it certainly isn't their job to do alone. And that's one of the things that as parents we need to do in community organizations with mentors and volunteers, and all of us pull up our bootstraps, and because you don't stop learning, you don't stop going to school, we got to figure out how to do it better. And I don't know how much legislation is needed to do that. I don't think a lot. You know, there's resources out there. We need to do a better job and communicate and draw in the resources that we have, and expect more of our parents and expect more of our kids, and where we have SROs and police officers get their input and put a better picture together than what we're doing a little bit now. And I think that the conversation and having it is helping that happen. There's town hall meetings happening across this country with little pockets deciding what to do within their community, within their school, to make it safer and make it better.
I'll just add that I think that the idea of those town meetings and talking directly with parents for each individual school district is so important. I know we've mentioned the importance of drills, and we've mentioned the importance of facilities, but there's no substitute for having that connection with parents and deciding locally what makes the most sense. We certainly value drills and safety, but I think if you talk to teachers, you'll hear that the drills are a real balance because they have to control the emotions that come with the drills, and they have to give up instructional time to do drills, and so that's always going to be part of the give and take of it. They're essential, obviously, but they are also present challenges for teachers. You know, I think you'd also hear a real strong message from the teachers groups surrounding the issues and ideas like the Marshall idea, that what I'm hearing from colleagues in the teachers organizations is that they support those of their members who are interested and available to do that, but they don't want it to become associated with being part of the job, because their primary function is as educators. They want to keep that relationship the way that it is, and they don't want something to interfere with that relationship.
No question. We would never expect a teacher who is not comfortable in that role to serve in that role. In fact, we only call for volunteers, so it'd be only people who volunteer for that. In many instances, we expect it will be people who are veterans or past law enforcement officers. This is an optional program for the district. The district can opt out. In fact, we have the support of TASB. We have the support of TASA. We have the support of CLEAT, which is the law enforcement agency here in Texas, TCLOS, who trains police officers, TMPA, all the police associations. So we've got law enforcement, we've got school boards, we've got school administrators. We have a number of teachers and parents groups that are with us. We have superintendents that are with us. So we have confidence that this solution, again, is narrow and tailored enough to provide an alternative for schools that so choose to have it. And we're hopeful that this will be able to a way to efficiently provide that last line of defense for a very real challenge that we have here in Texas.
And I mean, if this does become law, I mean, as districts are deciding whether or not to opt into this program, it is something that is going to require, I would assume, community engagement, at least at the school board level and with parents. But what do parents need? What do we need to do to get more parents engaged in that process?
Well, I think at this point we're waiting to see what the legislation is going to look like. I mean, there's options out there now, and districts are having meetings, and San Marcos did some sort of martial arts training, and some school districts are looking at their entrances and going ahead with some facilities money and capital money and making those changes. I think that parents are engaged in watching, and when we know what we need to go forward, whether that's going to start with, when you're going to build buildings in your school district, you've got citizens bond committees that get formed, and they've got their charge and they know what they're going to do. So I think, as the legislature comes to an end and we have an idea of what we're going to do, you're going to see school districts go back and form citizens safety committees, and they'll get appointees and volunteers to come forward and say, elementary, middle, and high school, here's what we need to do, on campus, off campus, and they'll come together and put a plan together. And that's, I think, we at this point we don't have all of our options before us. It's premature to sit there and say that this is the plan we're going to take, because we don't know what all's going forward. But there are things being done in schools. People have moved staff around just as a result. That doesn't take legislation to go do. So I think in a big picture, when the session's over and we know more what we're dealing with, and then can come back and say, well, we're going to increase a tax, or we're not, or we're going to put out a bond, or we're going to ask for a government grant, whatever that picture's going to look like, the pieces of that puzzle will start coming together.
I think to add to that, we've always advised parents to, approach the school and ask the principal, how are you doing? Do you have a plan? Is it current? And about the drills and about the reunification, and to be advocates for that, to ensure the fidelity of that planning, as well as youth. I think we've missed that piece, especially older youth, being ambassadors to the home and able to be that representative for safety and security. And I just wanted to touch back on the drill piece. As far as what we're advising with drills is to integrate that just into an ongoing way of life, not an event, so that they're part of the school day, and not pulling necessarily from valuable instruction, but even doing them during passing periods or cafeteria time when something's likely to happen. The story I always like to tell just briefly is the story of Rick Riscoria, who was over safety and security for Morgan Stanley on 9/11. Morgan Stanley had 23 floors of Tower 2 with several thousand employees, and he was their security guard who had insisted that they do drills, and he wasn't very beloved about that prior to 9/11. He was pulling the Morgan Stanley brokers away from multi-million-dollar clients to have them drill. He even insisted that visitors to the building know the exit strategy. And just as teachers, and I've been in education since 1975, and DISD started out there, we don't want to pull from valuable instruction, nor did they. But on 9/11, over 2,700 Morgan Stanley employees got out of Tower 2 alive, including 350 visitors to Morgan Stanley that day who were there to train. Only 14 died from that group, and that was mainly Rick Riscoria, the security guard, and his team, who wouldn't leave anyone behind. They knew how to go down those stairwells in the dark and in the smoke. They passed hundreds of people heading up to the roof, and he had taught them never do that. Don't count on helicopters. They knew to cross over to a different stairwell on the 14th floor. So the drills are so powerful, and even though people resent them until you need to know what to do, we find again and again that research shows that's what saves lives.